Hi, today I have an oven baked pork rib recipe. I'm using baby back ribs, also called pork loin ribs, and it's in a vacuum pack. As typical with my setup, I have my little trash bag, my cutting board over the sink, and then my steel bowl that I use to wash stuff. So I'm going to take this out of the bag, give it a rinse, and season and prep the ribs for baking. So first thing to do is remove it out of the bag. And drain the juices and give it a quick rinse. Alright, I've given the pork ribs a quick rinse. I'm just going to give it a quick dry with a paper towel. I don't have to dry it completely as if I were to fry these. And also with ribs, I tend to remove the membrane on the back. So that's pretty easy to do. If you have an opening, you could start pulling it off. And usually it just peels off. And it's always it's just finding where to start it. So once you get it started, you could use the paper towel to help pull it off. And as always, it's hard to figure out, people say that the membrane blocks flavoring to get to the ribs, and some people say, well, this side it's all bone, so I think if you're smoking it makes a difference, but since this is oven baked, it may not make a difference. But I am just doing this out of habit and to help maximize flavor. So here's the ribs washed, membrane remove, and we'll move on to the next step. All right, for the next step, I'm using a seasoning salt. You could use any type of salt you want. You could use salt, pepper, and onion powder, and this is just convenient. This is what I had. I have other seasoning salts, and one thing about seasoning salts is, it's mainly salt. So ribs can be prepared ahead of time, or as I'm doing it, I'm just seasoning and gonna put it in the oven. And be generous with the seasoning salt. Not overly generous, because this is, again, mainly salt. Just rub it in a little, make sure everything gets a little coating. And then also with the ribs, I'm going to add a half onion, coarsely sliced. So what I'm going to be doing is ribs are considered less tender cuts of meat. And with ribs, especially spare ribs, but these are baby back ribs, you cook low and slow. And I'm going to use the onions to provide moisture since it's cooking in the oven. And I think adds a little extra flavor. So now I'm going to move this to the oven and prep the pan. All right, here's the roasting pan I'm using. I just cooked a couple pounds of bacon in it, and this kind of inspired me to cook the ribs. There's a lot of nice, flavorful brown bits from baking the bacon, so I'm just scattering the onions on the bottom. And then next thing I'll do is just lay the ribs on top. I have the I have the oven set at 250. So low and slow. I'm going to wrap it and bake in the oven for about 2 hours, maybe 3. Depends on how tender you want the ribs. So I just scattered the onions about. And then I'm going to wrap the ribs so they just cook in its own steam and juices from the oven. Let me do it this way just so all the nice brown bits will flavor the ribs. And I try to make it airtight, so ready to go into the oven, 250, and I'll set the timer for 2 hours. All right, the ribs have been cooking in the oven for 2 hours at 250. I just took them out, so let's take a peek at how they look. I wrapped it up tight, so in some respects the ribs were steaming. As you could tell, it's doesn't have any color. I have a toothpick here, just starting to get tender. So what I'm going to do next is drain this. I'm jacking up the oven to 350, and I'm going to bake it for another hour when the oven comes to temperature at 350 to get some color in this. Also at that time, if you want, you could add barbecue sauce and start slathering the rib with barbecue sauce. And I tend to not like, that's 350, I tend to like my ribs on the dry side and add barbecue sauce on my own. All right, the oven's up to 350. Like I said, at this time you could start adding barbecue sauce on the ribs if you'd like. Since I don't like barbecue sauce, a lot of sauce on my ribs, I tend to, like I said, just cook it dry and then add sauce on the side. But however, I have all these juices. What I'll do is just brush the ribs with the juice and put this in the oven, 350 for an hour. So 350, and I'll leave it uncovered, so hopefully we get some nice browning. Just make sure I get some more nice coating. All right, into the oven, 350, 1 hour. All right, here are the ribs after an hour in the oven at 350. It's got some nice color. I'm using a toothpick to check in between the bones, and it's nice and tender. It's going in easily. So I think the ribs are done. I'll just let this cool off and I'll cut them up and serve them. Alright, the ribs have cooled down enough to handle, so I'm going to just cut them into their individual bones. And you could just go in between and just cut. The ribs. As you could tell, they're very tender. I'll plate these and then set up a plate for myself. If you like falling off the bone ribs, what you can do is bake them in the foil for longer than 2 hours, and that'll make them really soft and tender. So I'll plate this. Alright, here are the finished ribs plated. I could have done a fancier plating with lettuce underneath, but I just wanted to get it out and on the table. I have some low-carb spicy barbecue sauce. One thing about glazing the ribs before... one thing about glazing the ribs ahead of time is you'll get a nice, pretty color. So there's one advantage to glazing the ribs versus having them dry like this and then adding sauce as you like it. I'm going to take the small end, so this is probably going to be pretty good. I like the crispy bits, so a little barbecue sauce, and I'll give it a try. Meat is still tender, has it's not falling off the bone mushy. Like I said, if you want falling off the bone, you could leave it in the foil a little longer. Say instead of 2 hours, do 2.5 hours in the foil, and then open it up and baste with barbecue sauce and let it finish off the last 45 minutes. And I think you'll get a nice falling off the bone ribs. This still has it's tender, but it still has some texture.